On this episode of the podcast, we're going to be diving into the mind of Ali Houston. He is a former physicist turned food specialist, specialising in keto and paleo. Ali believes that it's not only your physical health that can be benefited by these diets, but also your mental well-being. And he cured his mental health with these diets. And he's going to be educating you on how you can do the same. Thank you so much for tuning in to this episode of Into the Mind. My name's Harrison, and I hope this helps. Ali, I have a quote from your website, and I'd like to read it to you. So, I fixed my health using the power of paleo and keto diets. Coming from an absolute dummy, what are paleo and keto?
So, starting with paleo, because that's where I started with this whole diet thing. Paleo is short for Paleolithic, which is a period of time before the Neolithic. So, before human beings started settling more heavily into kind of farming communities and that kind of thing, there was more of the kind of hunter-gatherer type setup. Mm-hmm. And it's not like an overnight thing that suddenly everyone went from hunter-gatherer to farmer. There's thoughts about how that happened. Interesting ideas like, the grasses that the cows that we were, the sort of wild cows that we were hunting, the grasses that they were eating, we realized that if we planted them, then maybe the cows would come to where we were and it'd be a bit easier. Mm-hmm. These interesting ideas about how, we domesticated grains, but they domesticated us. Anyway, we're talking about that transition. So before that transition, you're talking about the Paleolithic period. So basically like 10 to 15,000 years ago, before that, and then back as far as you can track kind of human-like creatures or human beings. Because like modern humans are probably a few 100,000 years old, and kind of hominids that are like human beings are millions of years old. And it almost doesn't make any sense, these numbers. Like you think about 1,000 years ago was like the Dark Ages, 2,000 years ago was like the time of Jesus and the Romans and everything. 2,000 years before that, you're talking kind of ancient Egypt, and it just gets lost in the mists of time so quickly. So to think about from 15,000 years ago right back to, say, 2.5 million years ago, where there's evidence of hominids butchering animals, like cut marks that are interpreted to be butcher marks. So we're talking about kind of, roughly speaking, a couple million years maybe to 15,000 years ago. That's paleo.
Yeah. And that diet would consist of what the kind of carnivore and very natural stuff, so to speak.
Yeah, it's hard to pin down, and it gets criticized a lot, and I think fairly, because, one of my ways into all of this was a guy called Weston Price, who was a dentist, but also a scientist from about 100 years ago. He was quite wealthy and wanted to travel the world and see what the health was like of traditional peoples. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of amazing that he did this, because there are kind of, there's data from other explorers who went around the world who happened to write about what they saw, but no one is as detailed as he was in so many different areas around the world. And what he found was that, unlike in the West, even by like the 1930s, there was, a fair amount of disease that was that we would now think of as diseases of civilization. Cancer, heart disease are the sort of main ones. Dementia as well, increasingly. And even by the 1930s, they were starting to come through. Whereas he would go and look at these traditional societies all around the world. You know, he went to the Scottish Hebrides, he went to the Maasai tribesmen in Kenya, he went to Asia, you know, all around, and I think Australia as well, the Aboriginal people. So he was a dentist first, so he would take photos of their teeth. He would see if there was any kind of dental caries rotting away, and he found that like pretty much across the whole kind of world of traditional societies, there was like, you know, a few teeth in every 1,000 had any decay whatsoever. These people were super, super healthy. Mm-hmm. And not just that, he measured their kind of vitamin status, and they were just healthy. There was no obesity. He couldn't see any signs of chronic disease. You know, if they lived past the age of about 14, then they would typically live into old age unless they got a serious infection or there was a serious accident. So the point about paleo being criticized as a term to describe a diet is that these people who were super, super healthy, they weren't tapped into the Western diet. We can talk about what that means, but they had a huge variety of their own diets. So if you look at Inuit people, and they might be eating seal blubber most of the year, and that was where most of their calories came from. And you know, they would eat all sorts of other things, like maybe sometimes there was berries in the summer when they were available. They would, you know, be able to forage mussels. They would you know, kill a variety of animals, but they were carnivores really. And the Maasai tribesmen, the tribespeople, and the men really, the women ate more plants, but the tribesmen would just like nick a vein or an artery from probably a vein from one of their cows and drink the blood. They've got a system.
The nutrients.
Yeah, exactly. So they herd cattle, and they've got a system where they just nick near the surface of the skin and drain the blood, but only so much that the cow doesn't even really feel it or notice. And so they take the blood as a kind of drink, and they also milk the cows, and that's most of their food. And occasionally they'll kill a cow and eat it.
You've opened up like 5 questions. I think the Western diet one's going to be one that we definitely get into. Obesity.
Yeah.
And our age at the moment, which I think, by the way, is horrendous.
Yeah.
And it's getting a lot worse.
Yes.
Dementia and the effects of food on dementia and mental health as well.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, we've kind of covered paleo.
Yeah, I just want to say about the fact that it's not just carnivores. There was people eating, you know, 95% of their calories from carbs as well. Or, you know, in traditional societies, exactly. So it's like, and it depends what you mean by natural, of course. But I get what you mean. It's like a whole food that you find in nature that's not really been messed with too much. And I think that's a reasonable definition of paleo. You can try. There's too many different types of traditional diet to really say there is a paleo diet. Yeah. We actually don't know what people ate back then. You know, talking tens, hundreds of thousands of years ago. We've got some evidence, like I say, of butchery 2 million years ago. But so we can be fairly sure that people hunted and ate, you know, game and meat. Yep. But how much of their diet was made up of plants is much harder to tell.
Yep.
So, you know, that's, I think, paleo. And then keto just means you're in a state of ketosis, which means that, you know, we're kind of like hybrid cars that can run on multiple different fuels. So you can eat glucose for your source of calories, and that could be sugar, it could be starch, like potatoes or rice, or you can run on fat. And lots of our tissues around the body can run on fatty acids that are made up of the fat that we eat. Or they can run on ketone bodies, which are made from fat. And there's a few different types of ketones. But if your body is producing ketones, you are in a ketogenic state, and if your diet is inducing that, then you're on a ketogenic diet. So keto just means that you're making ketones.
So in terms of how you go through the process to make ketones to be on the keto diet, would that consist of eating no carbs, no sugar, fat and protein? So you only eat fat and protein?
Yeah, so you'd be surprised if someone is metabolically like very healthy, so the way that the metabolism, the way that their energy production works is very healthy, then you could eat, 100 grams of carbs or so a day and find that you're still producing ketones. Mm-hmm. Babies produce a lot of ketones, and they're being breastfed typically quite a sweet milk. So there's like states where ketosis happens, where you've not totally restricted carbs, but that is the way that you reliably produce ketones is to restrict carbs, like you said, and so yeah, your diet would then consist of protein and fat.
And do some people with a naturally faster metabolism produce more ketones than someone without?
It's a good question. It depends what you mean by faster. I think different people and even an individual over time will metabolize things differently. So someone who starts a ketogenic diet might not really ever have used that machinery in their body very much in their whole life, because they've had 3 meals a day and snacks since they were a kid, which consisted of carby and processed food containing sugar, flour, veg oils, these kinds of things which impair the metabolism. So you could say that people might have they train their metabolism to produce ketones better. I think there's some people who are just at the genetic sort of extreme of things. Like a human cockroach who can eat whatever they like, smoke loads of cigarettes, and they live till they're 95.
Yeah.
And they're skinny as a whippet and happy.
Like me. Don't smoke, but I eat whatever I want.
Yeah. And so those people's metabolism, there's clearly something different. And to me, it comes down to something which is often overlooked called mitochondria, which are like sometimes known as the powerhouse or the power station of the cell. And if your mitochondria are working well, then you're working well. And that's quite a kind of deep thing, but to my mind, that's what having a good metabolism means, is being metabolically flexible so that if you want to eat glucose, you can, but that you are you easily produce ketones and can use fat for fuel.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And I think that kind of brings me on to the point of, firstly, processed foods. So now that we know that what, paleo and keto are, firstly, processed foods and also the Western diet. So from experience traveling, so I went around Vietnam, Thailand, Bali, the foods there are so much fresher, so much healthier, and I felt physically better when I was there. What has happened in Western society and the increase in processed foods, and why is it impacting us in a negative way?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and people have not agreed on this. Like that, you can find an expert from Harvard who'll disagree with an expert from Oxford about even what processed food is or means. One of my favorite people on this is a kind of a citizen scientist. He does have a science background, but now he's kind of predominantly a YouTuber and pig farmer. And the reason he got into pig farming is the quality of the fat. And the story really is, there's a problem with the word processing, because you go to a Michelin star restaurant and the food will be highly processed. But the ingredients will be top, and I bet if you ate just the starters and main courses from Michelin star restaurants your whole life, you'd probably be in pretty good shape, because it's usually just like really good meat, really good veg, done with a bit of flair. So Brad Marshall is this guy's name, and he was on my podcast, and he made the point that if you look at photos from 100 years ago at Yankee Stadium, because he's in New York State, you look at the very expensive seats, people wearing their best clothes and all that. You can't find an obese person.
Yeah.
But then if you look at the kind of USDA statistics for what food people were buying at the time, it's butter, cream, flour, sugar, and up to 4,000 calories a day per adult male per household, in these types of households. Mm-hmm. So they were eating these things, but obesity was rare. So what's been added since then? And that's where the fat comes in. So he thinks, and I think, and quite a lot of other people are starting to think too, that modern vegetable oils are the single worst thing that's happened to the food environment in the last 100 years. And they started off as a byproduct of industrial processes. So when you were making cotton, you had all these seeds. Mm. You could make an oil from it, but nobody knew what to do with it. And, is it an engine lubricant? What is it? And they realized it was getting into the food chain when some regulatory agency noticed that they were selling more lard in the United States than they were producing.
Really?
And they did the maths, and they realized it's been cut.
Yeah.
So the producers were just using this cottonseed oil and putting it into lard to save money. And I can't remember exactly what Crisco stands for, but it's the American kind of heritage brand vegetable oil. And it comes from that era where they were trying to work out how to deodorize it and shelf stabilize it. And they did. And these, like rapeseed oil, soybean oil, corn oil, crisp and dry, all these oils, they come from seeds, and they're highly subsidized, and so they're cheap to produce for the producers. And they've flooded the Western food system. And there's huge problems with refined sugar. There's huge problems with flour, particularly with autoimmune disease and mental health. But vegetable oil seems to be, to me, the major kind of culprit for obesity. And there's a really interesting paper that came out in Nature recently, one of the big science journals, and it's a couple of guys who I've followed for a few years. John Speakman, who's a professor in Aberdeen and Shenzhen, and Herman Pontzer, whose work is amazing. He's a professor in the United States, and he went out and studied the Hadza tribe in Tanzania, and they used this technique to measure how many calories people were using every day. And they thought, these are hunter-gatherers, they're going to be burning so many calories. Yeah. And what they found was, big surprise, which was that a hunter-gatherer who's out for 10 hours a day hunting burns the same amount of calories as someone who's sitting at their computer all day.
Why?
That's the question. So it seems that it's complicated, but that there's really a kind of a thermostat. It's like a kind of thermostat, but for how much energy we use. Mm-hmm. And so if we're out exercising, then our metabolic rate, the amount of energy that we're using otherwise, compensates. Mm-hmm. So this is why it's not really filtered into society. His work was on the cover of Time magazine. There's like no doubt that it's legit. But because it's so counterintuitive that we've been told to eat less and move more our whole lives, and that it makes sense that if you do work, you'll use calories. It just doesn't seem plausible that someone like a lean, muscular, active hunter-gatherer tribesman uses the same amount of calories as someone who's kind of really overweight sitting at their computer in Slough. You know what I mean? But that's the fact. Within a couple of percent over the long term.
Yeah.
So him and John Speakman and others brought out this paper recently, and it was measuring this calorie use over the last 40 years. And although energy expenditure has gone up, people are exercising more, their metabolic rate, so basically all the calories used by your body just to sort of be, has gone down. And that change can explain the obesity epidemic. And it's interesting because they're starting to reference these citizen scientists. And so Herman Pontzer, the guy who went to Tanzania, he actually on Twitter called out Brad Marshall saying his work is good on this and it may explain part of what's happening. Because the low carb world, the keto world, the paleo world kind of is, it's got the root cause analysis a little bit wrong with what makes us fat. They've said it's the carbs that did it. But if you look at Weston Price's work, where there was carnivores, but there was also people eating 95% of their calories from carbs who were thin and active and happy, and healthy. And it can't explain what's going on. So I think veg oils really should be seen as something to avoid pretty religiously, and that have caused an awful lot of damage and that are synonymous with processed food. So pretty much you can't pick up something that's been made by someone else for you to reheat or go out to a restaurant now without there being a lot of veg oils in there.
Yeah.
And so to come circling all the way back, the kind of word processed to me just in my head might as well mean veg oils.
Okay. So veg oils are definitely the thing to avoid.
Definitely. It's like, to me, the main common factor, there's 4,000 or so novel food ingredients which are approved in America that probably have some impact.
Yeah.
But if you look around the world, they're not, all 4,000 are not all around the world. And this started happening a long time ago before that variety of novel food ingredients, your E numbers and additives to help shelf life and flavor and all the texture and all the rest of it. So I know it's got worse over the last kind of 30, 40 years, but veg oils to me seem to be the biggest candidate.
Okay. And that kind of nicely brings me on to the effect on the brain that these diets can have. So you've talked quite openly about mental health. And I think this is something that a lot of people in society nowadays suffer with, a bad mental health, a bad relationship with themselves. And it's funny that I've seen so many podcasts, so many people talking about the effect that a diet can have on that mental health. So for you personally, and also what advice would you give to people that are firstly suffering from mental health and want to make a change, a positive change, but also the impact it had on your mental health when you changed your diet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's huge. And I think I can't really overstate how powerful it was for me and how powerful it can be for other people. So for me, I went from chronic anxiety, like really worried that bad things were going to happen almost all the time, seasonal depression to the point where, I had suicidal ideation at times, ADHD, which was diagnosed as an adult, and made sense of a lot of things from the past. You know, I performed well at school, but I didn't want to be there a lot of the time, and I struggled a lot. You know, if you look at my report cards, that definitely comes out. And various autoimmune diseases, which I think were involved with my mental health. Brain fog, couldn't think clearly, felt like a lot of the time I didn't have access to my brain, which I knew wasn't, I knew I wasn't daft, but sometimes I felt like I was. So all of these problems, and they were severe. And within weeks of making very specific change to my diet to make it ketogenic, these went away. And I thought, well, okay, you know, I was trying to explain to people how profound the change was, but you can't see that change necessarily. You can only feel it. And I was a bit concerned, actually, because I made that change in March 2016. And I would always enjoy the summer, feel a lot better mentally. And then when it came to sort of September time, when the nights were drawing in, I would start to dread what was coming, which was this seasonal depression. And it just didn't arrive. So for the first year that I could remember, I really enjoyed the autumn and the winter.
Seeing those season changes.
Yeah, and my mood was just high and even. And that is so profound. And then a couple of other anecdotes. So
I need to tell you guys about the sponsors of this channel. Chisholm Hunter are the brand new sponsors of the Into the Mind podcast, and it's quite fitting because day to day I get tons of questions about my jewellery and my watches, especially on the Chisholm Hunter YouTube channel. All my jewellery, including this necklace, these rings, and my watches are all from Chisholm Hunter. They're a UK-based company with 28 stores throughout the UK, and they're family run, and they've been going for about 165 years, which is pretty impressive. So if you want to get any luxury watches or jewellery, head to chisholmhunter.co.uk. That's chisholmhunter.co.uk. And on that note, back to the podcast.
Ian Campbell is in Edinburgh. He's an academic. He used to be a music producer for Rockstar Games. And in fact, going back a bit further, he was quite successful in the music industry. He was assistant to the guy who did the music for Shrek, and, you know, very accomplished musician. But he had lifelong problems with bipolar, particularly bipolar 2, which he calls the shit sequel to bipolar 1 that should never have been made. It basically means that you've got less mania and more depression. And it's, for people who don't know, it's a life-ruining condition. You know, serious mental disorders like bipolar, schizophrenia, they ruin people's lives, basically. So, and they're typically given as a lifelong diagnosis. So it can be controlled in some people to some extent with drugs, but there's always a trade-off. There's always side effects, and the positive benefit of these drugs is variable between individuals. So he stumbled upon a ketogenic diet because he'd heard that it can help you lose weight. One of the side effects of a lot of psychiatric medication is to mess with your metabolism and make you gain weight. And so he thought, well, if my life is shit, I might as well be thin. And it was very shortly after he started a ketogenic diet, he said he was on the bus and it was like the national grid came on in his brain for the first time since he was a kid. And he was like, what is going on here? And that was 7 years ago. And he has not gone back into a depressed bipolar state since.
Why is that? What effect do you think that keto diet had on his brain to make that change?
So there's multiple potential mechanisms, and he changed his life. He recently left the music business to be a full-time academic, and he did his PhD in his spare time on the way to doing that, to understand why it worked. Mm-hmm. And in some senses, that's why I changed career as well from physics and engineering to what I'm doing now, because it was such a profound effect for me. It was such a profound effect for him. He thought, if this can work for other people, I have to try to make it work for other people.
To help other people.
Exactly. So it could be that it probably depends on why your brain isn't working right in the first place. Mm-hmm. So for people with bipolar, they quite often talk about it feeling like you're drowning somehow. And so there's this effect of a lack of kind of energy being available, which is what happens in a sense when you're drowning. You know, you don't have the oxygen to power what you're doing. And so he's very interested in this area of mitochondria, you know, the little it's not totally accurate to say they're like the little power stations of the cells, but it's a kind of reasonable way to think about them, I think. He's interested in these little power stations of the cells, the mitochondria, because they're all over the body, including the brain, and if they're not working correctly, then you don't have enough energy. And so if that happens in the brain, then your brain's not going to perform as well as it can. And depending on what your genes are and what your background is and your, you know, what you've been through in your life, you know, different people, it'll, come out in different ways. So for me, it was anxiety, seasonal depression, ADHD, brain fog, that kind of thing. For Ian, it was bipolar. And why does a ketogenic diet help some people? It might be that when your metabolism breaks to some extent, you stop being able to use glucose effectively. And that can be a real problem in the brain, which is a very hungry organ. You know, proportional to its weight, it uses far more energy than other tissue in your body. And it's a bit of a question mark, you know, how can we afford as animals to have such a energy hungry brain? You know, we need so much energy to fuel it. But if we can't use glucose effectively, then we're in trouble, unless we've got an alternative fuel source. And ketones are, the brain cells love ketones. They can run very efficiently on them. The mitochondria love them. So it might be that there's, over time, when your metabolism's a bit broken, you stop being able to use glucose as well. So ketones work really well.
So you think that some people's brains don't react as well to don't react as well to glucose as they do ketones. And you think that if people make that switch, that transition, people that need to, their brain could work better with ketones instead of glucose?
Yes, definitely. And I always try and put it through a paleo lens as I think of it. If you think about a hunter, you know, if they're going hunting and trying to outsmart an animal, it makes sense that over time, the humans who survived would be the ones who would get better at hunting over the sort of day or two that they hadn't eaten. Mm-hmm. And that's what happens when you go into ketosis. If you stop eating, fasting, then your body will produce ketones. And you start to become mentally sharper. And it's the human beings that happened to over the course of history that would have survived, rather than the ones that became more sluggish when they were hunting.
That's extremely interesting to me. I think partially because a couple of my friends at the moment have tried fasting and they said the first day sucked. The second day they felt like a weight had been lifted off, and they felt, as you say, sharper. Which is, what is the effect? So the effect is when you fast that more ketones are released in the brain, and you're burning your fat directly instead of the energy that you're putting into your body. And you think that stimulates the brain in some way.
Yeah, so using ketones, the brain seems to like ketones. So whether you're using a ketogenic diet or you're fasting and producing ketones for energy in the brain, it certainly seems that sharpens people up, even if they don't have mental disorders. So that's one way that it could have helped myself, could have helped Ian. There's levels of inflammation in the body which are, there's always some reason for inflammation. It's a good thing to have if you sprain your ankle or something, because it means that the body's healing it. But chronic inflammation produces substances in the body that can cause problems in and of themselves. And so the breakdown products of inflammation, if it's chronic, can affect the brain. And so this is why I mentioned gluten earlier, because your flour, because a lot of the problems can start in the gut, and gluten is terrible for the gut. And maybe 1 or 2% of the population ends up being diagnosed as celiac, but that's not even the half of it.
It's funny, my brother's actually a celiac. Do you think there's a specific cause that is brought on that condition, or do you think it's more genetic?
So it's a mixture of, all of these things, it's a mixture of genes and environment. But, wheat is what causes symptoms in celiacs. And you need a genetic profile to end up with a diagnosis of celiac disease. But, can you be profoundly damaged by wheat and not be diagnosed with celiac? Yes. So there's a spectrum of how people's bodies react to wheat. And, wheat is like I said earlier, in a way, it's domesticated us, because before it was just like a kind of grass that was scattered to the winds, and now it's one of the most successful plants ever. So the changes that have been made to wheat thousands of years ago to make it better for human consumption, I'm not sure if we did that or whether that was an accident, but anyway, it damages us.
Yeah.
And the guy who really, so like maybe 40 years ago, this would have sounded like junk science that, you shouldn't listen to. Oh, it's only a very few people have a problem with it. Everyone else is fine. I just think that is nonsense, and that there's a brilliant researcher, an Italian guy who works in America, Alessio Fasano, and he worked out why wheat is damaging. And the main reason is the proteins in the wheat which make your gut open to, essentially when you eat food, a lot of researchers and doctors think of the inside of your body only starting in your bloodstream in your gut, or next to your gut, and that inside your mouth, inside your stomach, and into your small intestine, that's still outside your body in a sense. And so what is it that opens up and lets food into the bloodstream? Well, it's these little doorways, these little junctions, they're called tight junctions. And what wheat does is it opens them when they shouldn't be open. And then things get in the bloodstream that shouldn't be in the bloodstream.
And that's what makes you feel sluggish and slower.
Yeah, it can affect all tissues in the body. And so autoimmune diseases, and celiac's actually a special case as well, because I think there's this specific response to gluten which like in itself is an autoimmune reaction, but basically like which can cause further damage to wherever the gluten is. But In everyone, to some extent, gluten opens these tight junctions so that things get into the bloodstream which shouldn't be there. And once they're there, your immune system is like, well, what are you doing here? And if it gets into specific tissues, it's going to attack those tissues. So people end up with autoimmune diseases. And to me, the main culprit is wheat. And autoimmune diseases are everywhere. Yeah. You know, you're talking about psoriasis, multiple sclerosis, pernicious anemia, alopecia, the ones I had, sarcoidosis, this achalasia thing where my food pipe closed, you know, other things in my family like autoimmune thyroid disease, like really common diseases that people don't kind of tend to thread together as having a common cause. Mm-hmm. So
you think that's wheat?
Yeah.
Partially.
Yeah, I do. Probably mainly.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so that's an advantage of a paleo diet, is that it tends to cut out grains, because we didn't really tend to eat grains, we think, before 10,000 years ago or so.
From that conversation, I've written an extra like 10 questions. But I think one of the really interesting ones that I was learning about the other day was the manipulation of fruit and veg in today's society.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Now, if you look at a banana
yeah.
from 100 years ago,
yeah.
it's tiny, it's seeded, and it's not half as sweet. And what we've done, a bit like with dogs, they're derived from wolves. We have a pug, so that's derived from a wolf. It's mental. But these big bananas that are really sweet now, they've been genetically engineered through hundreds of years to be bigger and sweeter than the predecessor. And I suppose my question there is, do you think this has had an extremely negative impact in terms of the food that we eat nowadays that we think is healthy, but actually it's been genetically modified for X amount of time to be bigger, sweeter, more glucose? What are your kind of thoughts?
Yeah, I think definitely the amount of fiber that's there has changed, so that in some ways it's been denatured, refined in a sense. But then Weston Price, going back to his work, he noticed that people in the tropics would eat freely from tropical fruit trees, where, you know, you're talking about like papayas and stuff, which haven't really been modified too much. That's just how they tend to grow, and ate very sweet things. Or hunter-gatherers who would eat honey a lot, or people eating very starchy things. Starch tends to break down to glucose. So I think what's happened is our metabolisms have broken. Mm. Yes, we've modified these fruits to make the sugar that's in them more available. But in a properly working metabolism, you should be able to have glucose. So I don't see that as a big issue. Mm-hmm. I think eating loads of vegetables might actually be a worse thing for people's health. They've been they've been selectively bred.
Yeah.
You know, if you look at all the cruciferous stuff, like your broccoli and so on, then there's a common ancestor there. It's like a mustard root. It doesn't look very appetizing. It's kind of, you know, and all these like things that we eat big volumes of. I don't think we would necessarily be doing that historically. And you look at Weston Price's work again, people were eating vegetables, but to varying extents. And there's stuff in vegetables that are there as protection from consumption. So fruit is a bit different, because the method of reproduction of fruit tends to be get eaten, the pips, the seeds, pass through whatever animal's eating it. Great for the fruit.
Yeah. It
gets like, you know, some free fertilizer when it gets dropped out. That's the system. With vegetables, it's not. They tend to be sort of flowering, and they, you know, so they rely on pollination. And so they can't run anywhere. Mm. They're not like a bison who's massive and has horns and stuff. They have to engage in the kind of biological arms race that we're all engaged in all the time against viruses and other things that would destroy us. So what does a plant do? Well, it creates chemicals that fight off predators. So I think vegetables are actually potentially worse, and that although they don't mess with the metabolism in the same way that sort of vegetable oils do, that for some people, again, probably the extreme end of things, particularly with mental health, they can cause problems. You know, there's anecdotes of people who've been on a ketogenic diet for a long, long time, who then go on a carnivore diet with cut out all plants, and their serious mental disorder gets better.
And on that note, I think Jordan Peterson was one of those people. So he started, and you'll do a better job of explaining this diet than me. Was it solely meat? It was only, what was the meat that he had?
He just eats beef.
And that's it.
I think he might have lamb as well, but yeah, just ruminant meat.
And he explained that his autoimmune diseases, his mental health, took a huge skyrocket after starting this diet. What do you think that was?
Yeah, this is a bit of an open question, even amongst people who have been thinking about it for a long time. Amber O'Hearn is another one who was on a ketogenic diet for a long time and had bipolar, and when she went carnivore, her bipolar went into remission. That was about 10 years ago, and in fact it was more than 10 years ago now, and it's not come back. So it's very compelling. And she's a very careful computer scientist, so she writes very eloquently about this, and in depth and detail that 99% of people will not want to get into. But to me, my background is sort of physics and engineering. To truly understand something, to predict how it's going to act, and to plan at scale, you want to know how something works.
Yeah.
But at some stage, you have to test your theory. And sometimes, particularly with product engineering, if it works, you just leave it alone. Because you're not sure what's going to work, and you don't want to keep tinkering. So I can see the value as an experimentalist of, if something works, great.
Yeah.
And so I really want to know why it works for some people, and because if you can do that, then you can hopefully replicate it. And like the studies that are being done on ketogenic diets, most people tend to improve with mental disorders, but some people get completely better, and some people don't find that it helps them at all. So what's happening with those people? Why can't those people get better, seemingly? Do they need to go carnivore? Do they need to cut out all plants completely? Is it something else that could be done besides that? Because again, you've got to live your life.
Yeah.
Some people just don't want to just eat beef and lamb all the time. They want to have vegetables. They want to have fruit. Some people find that they need to stay ketogenic, so fruit is always going to be off the table. But so understanding what it is important. But honestly, nobody knows why exactly. They can guess that it's maybe something to do with gut integrity. There's people who have negative reaction to plants that kind of flares up gut bacteria that then in a damaged gut gets into the bloodstream and then has secondary effects in the brain. That's plausible, but I don't think anyone knows for sure.
Yeah.
So I always say to clients that if you want to try what has worked for some people at that end of things, then carnivore is the way.
Yeah.
You can start there. It's almost like a perfect baseline elimination diet. And then if you get a baseline where you feel great, then you can introduce things one at a time and see, does that have a negative effect or not. And people really find their way doing that, so they can go from, and I think Jordan Peterson's tried that, where he's tried to reintroduce things and it's not worked. So he's just had to stay there. He doesn't like it, but it's the only thing that works. And similarly with his daughter, Michaela, who spoke at Amber O'Hearn's conference, Carnivore conference. She had dreadful autoimmune arthritis, had joints replaced when she was a teenager, and carnivore is the only thing that's worked for her, particularly actually just ruminant meat. So that's kind of how I think of it, as like the perfect elimination diet. And people worry about nutrients and stuff, but you get everything you need from ruminant meat. It's very, very nutritious.
Yeah. I think on that note, so there's...
I should actually say, you might not get everything you need from ruminant meat. Some people do need extra things, like eggs are really good, round it out nutritionally, but yeah.
I think that there's obviously the autoimmune fixes that come with these diets. And there's so many different factors, people can't pinpoint it exactly, but it definitely has a positive impact in the whole, from afar, taking the picture as a whole. But the mental health aspect is really fascinating as well. I suppose I was learning about glucose and how glucose obviously spikes your mental activity and spikes your whole body, and you have energy, but then after that glucose spike, you crash. Mm-hmm. Now, the interesting thing about this is that you're not technically stable when you start having glucose. Do you think that that is an impact on the mental state and mental health, and maybe that's why these diets can solve some of these problems like seasonal depression, like anxiety? You're not having these huge spikes, you're more stable. Do you think that has an impact?
Yeah, I think it definitely can. Like I say, glucose shouldn't disrupt people's mental or physical state too much if they're metabolically healthy. So if it does, it might be a sign that they're not metabolically healthy. Mm-hmm. So it's a bit of a question mark, because you see people like, for example, Glucose Goddess, who's doing these continuous glucose monitor measurements. So she does these graphs of her kind of blood glucose over time when she eats certain things, and you can impact that through increased fiber, or what time of day you do it, or whether you start with the protein and fat bit and then have the glucose later. It's actually, if you're metabolically healthy, then it's probably not super unhealthy to have a dessert once in a while after your meal.
Yeah.
Your body metabolizes it much better like that. But those peaks and troughs of energy, we've all felt them, when we get hangry.
Yeah.
And I think it comes from not being metabolically flexible. So if your available glucose disappears because you've used it, or because it's been kind of stored away for later use, then you start to feel that hangry feeling. But if you've got a flexible metabolism where you can use fat, you can use ketones, then the transition is actually more smooth.
Yeah.
So like, you can store about 2,000 calories of about a day's worth of glucose in your muscles and your liver. But even the skinniest marathon runner has about 50,000 calories of fat on them. So if you can learn to access that and be metabolically flexible, like your friends who are fasting, mm-hmm. then it's a win. It's a huge win.
Absolutely. And on that note, I suppose, so there's the sort of natural cures to mental instability, like depression or anxiety. And then there's obviously the drugs that the doctors can give to kind of, they're not curing it, but they're kind of putting a plaster over it. What are your thoughts on these drugs? Like, I think there was one of them, citalopram. Is it citalopram? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And there's a couple of different ones. What are your thoughts on those drugs instead of the natural solutions?
Yeah, I did training last year with one of my heroes, Dr. Georgia Eade, who's a psychiatrist. Trained, she's from Massachusetts. She went to Harvard. She worked at Harvard for a time, helping students with their mental health. and then she worked in college mental health and her own private practice, and she started using nutrition somewhere along the way and realized that not only did it work, but there was good reasons why it could work. And I asked her the question on my podcast, what is the difference between a win now as a nutritional psychiatrist versus a win when you were predominantly using a mixture of drugs and psychotherapy? Because psychiatry can be a blend. It depends on your background and training and preference, and what the patient wants, like between psychotherapy where you talk to them in a particular mode, whether that's CBT or person-centered therapy, counseling kind of thing, and the drugs. And she said the difference in the win is that when she was prescribing more medication, someone might have gone from thinking about dropping out of university to being able to finish university. That's not nothing, you know. Drugs can really, really help people. She said that she always had to say to them, similarly with a ketogenic diet, but she always had to say to them, I don't know how this drug is going to affect you. It might make you worse. Coming off it might be hellish, but it might make you better to some extent. So, you know, the patient would then choose whether to do it or not. And then she said a win with ketogenic therapy means that they've got their lives back completely. They've got complete remission of whatever mental disorder they had. So that's someone with very good training through the Harvard medical system. You might say that's the sort of pinnacle of pharmacological and psychotherapy training that you could get in the world, potentially. And she practiced that for years, and that's as good as it gets. People sort of can get back on their feet.
Yeah, so it's almost like drugs to an extent are a sticking plaster for the underlying issue, and they can help people through a period, but they're not getting to maybe the root of the problem. And the diet could potentially get to that root of the problem.
Yeah, I can't think of a psychiatric medication, because as you mentioned citalopram, which is an SSRI, which is about serotonin reuptake, but there's the different drug classes that act on different mental disorders in different ways. I can't actually think of a single one which is about stemming the root cause. So getting to the root cause and fixing it. It really is about trying to affect a pathway downstream of this root cause. What if the root cause is you've got a metabolic disorder where your metabolism is just not working right? A ketogenic diet can fix that permanently. So that's why we find people just transforming their mental health on a ketogenic diet sometimes.
And I suppose on that note, there'll be lots of people watching this that might firstly suffer with they're maybe obese, or they want to lose weight, or they're struggling with their mental health. I know that you've got a new website. Is it MetSci?
Yep.
MetSci.com. So I know that helps people from talking to you, but explain what that website does and how you can help people through their diet mentally and physically.
Yeah, so my colleague at MetSci.com is Dr. Rachel Brown, who's a senior psychiatrist in Edinburgh, and she works in crisis mental health team there, which is for people who are, you know, acutely mentally unwell. And so she's got a lot of experience working with serious mental disorders, and she herself actually is a carnivore. So she's on Instagram at Carnivore Shrink, and she is super interested, like I am, in how mental health can be improved through diet and lifestyle. And so we got together and decided, let's, you know, make Scotland an example of how we can kind of trailblaze with this and show that we're not just sort of the sick man of Europe, which is kind of the reputation that we have. You might have heard of the Glasgow effect, where, you know, if you get on the train in the West End for every stop you lose a year of life expectancy or something. It's absolutely dreadful. There's places in Glasgow that have a lower life expectancy than, like Baghdad. It's dreadful. So we wanted to show the world and help the world that, and tell them that the eating and your lifestyle can really transform mental disorders. And so that's why we started MetPsy, which is short for Metabolic Psychiatry. It's this idea that you change your metabolism, you can change your mental health. And I should say that obviously if the ketogenic diet is what going to work for you, that's a very profound change in your metabolism. And if you're already on psychiatric medication, then you need to work closely with whoever's prescribing you that medication.
Yeah.
Because what people can find is that they can sometimes get a little bit worse before they get better. Also, that they might have to taper down the medication to stop them from getting reactions or effects that they don't want. So that's like front and center, I have to say. If you're going to use a ketogenic diet for your mental health and you're being prescribed medication, you have to work with the person who's prescribing it.
Yeah.
So that's what MetPsy is. It empowers people to do that with their prescriber. Or people who don't have a diagnosed mental disorder. They just identify as not feeling as sharp or happy or fulfilled as they could. And they want to try something. Maybe they're anxious, maybe they're down sometimes. Maybe they don't feel so good about their body because, Amber O'Hearn, who I mentioned earlier, says, a lot of people with carnivore or keto, they come for the weight loss and they stay for the mental health benefits. And it's so true. But, I guess with MetPsy, you could say the reverse. You can come for the mental health benefits and stay for the weight control. And so we offer coaching services. Basically, we offer coaching services, whether that's one-to-one or in small groups, or later this year we're launching an app and we're launching a course that people can get all the information they need to do this themselves and work with us on live Q&As to get any extra information that they need to make this lifestyle change work for them and their mental health.
And you mentioned before, when we were talking a little bit before, and you said that the diet is a huge component and part of it, and I truly believe that. And I think that also sleep is a huge part of it, and for your diet, you can help your sleep. What are the ways that people can help their sleep through diet?
Yeah, so it's a really deep question, and I think it's iterative as well, so that if you don't sleep well, then your blood glucose and willpower and all of that the next day, not good. So you might eat things that then
spike it.
Yeah, make you sleep less well for whatever reason, and the vicious cycle continues. And it's more of a virtuous cycle if you can eat things which are better for your metabolism. A lot of people find that stopping eating before, say, 8 or 9 p.m. is better for their sleep. Some people find that if they go, say, very low carb, then their sleep can actually be negatively affected for a time. Some people don't need to go keto or low carb for their mental health or their physical health, but they find that they actually, they quite like having some carbs at the end of the day, and that helps them sleep. But I don't think that's necessary. Usually in the long term, you can work out a way to do low carb or keto where that doesn't affect your sleep negatively. Usually it's about working out the foods and the amount of fat that you're getting that allows you to be properly fueled. But definitely blue light is a big problem. So thinking through the paleo lens again, what light was ancestrally available to humans?
Natural.
It's natural light. It's the sun and maybe fire. But what we have now is screens that are spewing out blue light, which signals in our eye and then to our brain and metabolism that it's daytime. And that's so profound. So I use like blue light filters on my phone and my computer screen. And some people go a step further and use blue blocker glasses.
I've actually got blue blocker glasses.
Do you use them? Have you noticed a difference?
Yes, especially because I do videography, photography. When I edit late at night. And before, when I wasn't using them, I would go to bed and my mind would be racing. When I did use them, I had a noticeable difference that I was more tired when I got to bed.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is the thing, like, I think with so many things that are divorced from our ancestral environment, we just get used to them so quickly that we think there can't be a problem.
It's normal. It's
normal, but there is a problem with light. And I encourage people to get out in the sun as much as they can without burning, which if you're eating properly, actually people tend to find that it takes longer for them to burn. So I know Andrew Huberman's really big on this, getting light in the morning, and even if it's just going out for a 10-minute walk, and then in the evening blocking blue light. To some extent, some people find they're more sensitive than others, and I don't personally wear blue blocking glasses, although I think there's nothing wrong with that, except it makes everything look orange. And sleep hygiene, like beyond light, like having a cool room. These things all feed into each other, because the other thing we were talking about was connection, and how that mental health is not just about what you're eating. It's also about your history of psychology. So have you been through trauma? That's going to have a huge effect, and that's going to affect your sleep potentially too, and your blood glucose control. Like, all of these things are linked. And it's interesting talking to people who have a history of trauma, who've changed their diet. You wish you could wave a magic wand and something bad that happened to someone didn't happen, but you can't do that. But why wouldn't you want to be in as good a condition as possible to then get some therapy to deal with that trauma, whatever it may be? But yeah, going back to sleep, the blue blocking's huge, and I guess trying not to engage in stressful tasks after a certain time. Everyone's busy, but that's been big for me. Switching off.
I suppose when we get into everyone's different, so I think your job can be very difficult because you need to diagnose tons of a wide spectrum. You need to figure out what's going on with a huge spectrum. So there's no silver bullet, so to speak. But you can take the steps necessary to help these people. I suppose, what have you found is the most beneficial thing in your life for your mental health? Has it been the diet? Has it been sleep?
I think diet. And I was going to mention exercise as well, because exercising, doing something that you like regularly, especially if maybe you're exerting yourself, so like lifting weights or getting out of breath, doing something that you like, whatever it is clearly good for your health.
Yeah.
Even if, like we were saying earlier, it's not really about burning calories. It's about being insulin sensitive. It's about growing muscle so that you're strong. It's about sometimes feeling connected to the people that you're doing it with, all of that stuff. And that can help you sleep. But I would always say to people, like, get the diet in first before you start trying to exercise a lot. You might not have the energy yet. You might actually damage your joints if you're very overweight and you try to do a lot of exercise. There's always things you can do, and you can be gentle about it. You could do low impact stuff, whatever you enjoy. But I think diet comes first, and it's the same with sleep, that you can, do all these things that are quote unquote the right things for sleeping. But if your diet is not good, then it's not going to help as much as it could. Yeah. And it might even not work at all. Like if you're still eating loads of sugar and you're still dead amped up when you're trying to go to sleep and you feel anxious, then you can't just will yourself to sleep, you know? You can't say sleep, sleep, and you're asleep. So you're in control of your diet in a way that you're not in control of your sleep, if you understand me.
Yeah, and I think that we were talking earlier about alcohol and the effect that alcohol has on sleep. Would you suggest that someone that's obviously struggling with this diet and struggling with sleep, would it be a quit alcohol? Or would it be a tailor the amount of alcohol? I've heard that if you drink one beer, a singular pint, your REM sleep decreases by 40 to 50% in that night.
Yeah, I'd not heard that, but I believe it, and it's been my experience. You know, I used to drink a lot. Coming from the west of Scotland, it's pretty standard. And I've more or less stopped drinking. I sometimes, it might be a few times a year maybe, for really special occasions. And it's not because I act towards it addictively. I have been addicted to cigarettes and food, I would say, but it's more that it just, I weigh the pros versus the cons, and alcohol loses.
Yeah, always.
So, and then I was thinking, like, what are the negative effects of just having one or two? And actually, they were still pretty bad. You know, actually, it could have a really negative effect on my mood over the course of the next week, even. Some people are just more sensitive like that, and certainly disrupted sleep. I noticed that if I was having a glass of wine with dinner, then sometimes I'll wake up in the night kind of with palpitations and kind of like breathing fast. And I'd read that sulfites in wines can cause that reaction. So I went for sort of biodynamic, organic wine without sulfites. And that did stop that problem. But my sleep quality wasn't as good. I felt it the next day. You know, this idea that small amounts of alcohol are good for us, I don't believe it. I don't think that the research is really that strong on that. I think that we want to believe it.
Yeah, because everyone drinks.
Yeah, and also that it does feel good and that it can help social connection. There's no doubt about it. There's pros to drinking. Otherwise, people wouldn't do it. But for me, it's not worth it, and it gets in the way of sleep for sure, and it gets in the way of other parts of my health, like mental health, that I'm just not willing to compromise on, and it's really bad for the gut.
Yeah. I heard an interesting study the other day. I think it was on TikTok. But I believe it to be true. If you drink an alcoholic drink, your dopamine raises 2x. So you feel great for 15 minutes and then it starts to fall, which is why you start craving the next pint and the next drink and the next drink. If you take a line of cocaine, it goes up 2.5x for 7 minutes and then it begins to drop below the original point. So that's why you get come downs off cocaine and people have withdrawal symptoms from cocaine. If you take a cold water plunge, which is what we were talking about earlier, your dopamine in your brain raises 2x. But it raises for 2.5 hours and there's no fall below the original line, which is, I believe that to be true. I was just wondering what your takes are. Do you also believe that?
Yeah, dopamine's a funny one. The dynamics of dopamine, I think I haven't properly tried to understand. I think it's key to motivation, but all I know is that with the cold plunge stuff, again, through the paleo lens, it makes sense ancestrally. We wouldn't have had heated pools.
Or heated homes.
Except with gathering around a fire. But, the water that we would bathe in, wash in, etc., would be cold typically, I think. So it makes sense that we would be ancestrally matched to bathing in cold water. It's kind of funny that the effect is so strong. And in a way, I guess it's like what I was saying earlier. It's good to know mechanisms and understand them so that you can make more recommendations or even like tweak it up so that it works better. But if it feels good and it's not hurting you, then why wouldn't you do it?
Yeah, and it's totally natural.
Yeah, so there's this, I know about the mammalian diving reflex where your heart rate goes down, you feel calmer, and that lasts a long time if you've got cold water touching your face for a certain amount of time, and this is like true for all mammals. And so we're sort of programmed, if you like, to enjoy diving into cold water and to swim through it underneath. Yeah, I mean, I think it's true. I don't know about the dopamine dynamics, but I know that I feel really good when I do that, and that the effect is long lasting, hours rather than minutes, and that I don't feel bad afterwards. Yeah, where's the downside? Except it's quite uncomfortable.
And for someone watching this that is looking for, there's no quick fix. As you said, there's no silver bullet. You know, everyone is different, everyone is unique. What are a couple of steps that they can take right now to firstly increase their physical health through diet, but also their mental health?
Yeah, I think people have to decide where their line is. What I always tell clients who are reluctant to maybe take a plunge into a ketogenic diet or a carnivore diet or whatever is, yeah, you can start slow and you can maybe try a sort of paleo style diet where you're really just going for whole foods, which are ancestrally appropriate, and you're talking about sort of the fruit and veg aisle and the meat aisle, and maybe like some rice or some sweet potato, basically avoiding gluten and in some cases dairy, and then see how you feel in that space, and then move on to something else. Or you could try keto and or carnivore and see how you feel. And if you do that for a couple of months and you don't like it, all the foods that you currently eat all the time, they're still going to be there.
Yeah.
Just because you stop them, it doesn't mean someone's going to take them away forever. So imagine, you know, your life changes in the same way that it did for me. What would that mean to you? Why not try it? And, you know, I think there's a bit of tension between encouraging people to make a change and suggesting something that seems extreme to some people. But I think there's really good reasons why these types of diets can be so profoundly helpful. And, you know, Jordan Peterson hates his diet. Ian Campbell wishes he could go back to eating the way he used to and still feel good, but he can't. He has to stay on a ketogenic diet. I'm the same. It's not that I stopped liking donuts.
Yeah.
It's that they never liked me, and that I just feel amazing when I don't eat those things and I eat a ketogenic diet. So I would just say to people, you have to decide where your line is here, and if you're ready to make a change, try it out. Look for the best information you can and go for it. Because, you know, Krispy Kreme's going to be there in 2 months.
Dunkin' Donuts is going to be there.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Ali, thank you very much for all of that. There's so many more questions that I would love to ask you. I'd love to keep you here all day, but I don't think that's physically possible. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Yeah, we can hash it out in the comments.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Into the Mind podcast. If you have enjoyed this episode, if you've got some knowledge and taken away something from this episode, please consider hitting that subscribe button from wherever you are. It really helps more than you know, and we'll be back in a couple of days.